Imagine this for a second. You're walking home at night. Same route, same routine. Nothing feels wrong. But what if someone is watching you and you don't even realize it? That's exactly how Gus Lamont's final night began. At first, everything looked normal. No panic, no signs of danger. Just another routine walk. So how did something so ordinary turn into one of the most unsettling parts of this case? When the FBI finally reconstructed his last known movements, they didn't just look at where he went, they analyzed how he moved, step by step, second by second. And that's when the question started. Why did Gus suddenly change direction? Why did he pause in a place that made no sense? And most importantly, was he really alone? Because when investigators reviewed the footage again, they noticed something no one had seen before. A figure, always just behind him. Never too close, never too far. Just enough to go unnoticed. So now you have to ask yourself, was it a coincidence? Or was someone following him? Deliberately? What you're about to see is the FBI's reconstructed timeline of Gus Lamont's final hours, built from overlooked details, movement patterns, and moments that were almost ignored. This isn't just a timeline, it's a pattern. And by the end of this video, you'll be looking at this case very differently because one final detail doesn't fit, and it may change everything you think you know. The Outback does not feel like a place where time moves forward in a straight line. It feels like it pauses, stretches, and sometimes swallows moments whole. On the surface, the day was ordinary. A child playing, a family working, a landscape so wide and quiet that even sound seems careful not to break it. But later, when investigators looked back at that same day, they didn't see ordinary anymore. They saw the beginning of something they could not fully explain. And the hardest part? It started in the most innocent way possible. A 4-year-old boy playing in dirt. No alarms, no warning signs. Just a normal afternoon that would slowly begin to feel less and less normal with every passing minute. The last clear image of normal life. At around 5 p.m., Gus Lamont was last seen outside near the Homestead area. A child in a wide, open landscape. The kind of place where there are no fences strong enough to contain curiosity. Just earth, wind, and distance. He was playing in the dirt. Simple, harmless play. But here's the first quiet question investigators later returned to. Why does the simplest moment sometimes become the last confirmed moment? Because in remote places like this, there are no cameras on every corner. No neighbors watching windows. Only space. And space does not remember details. It only remembers silence. The illusion of just a few minutes. Reports later confirmed that Gus was left alone for a short period of time. Around 30 minutes. Not long on paper, but in an environment like this, 30 minutes does not behave like 30 minutes. It stretches. It bends. It becomes something else entirely. Because nothing in that landscape tells you time is passing. No traffic, no footsteps, no voices. So the first unsettling question appears. How much can change when nothing looks like it is changing at all? A world that feels bigger than it should. Oak Park Station is not just a home. It is distance turned into daily life. A sheep station surrounded by isolation. Miles of open land separating one structure from another. For a child, this is not just a backyard. It is a world without edges. And that becomes important later. Because investigators didn't just ask what happened. They asked, what makes a place feel safe when it is this alone? And more importantly, what happens when safety is assumed instead of watched? The silence that should have been loud. Later accounts describe a key moment. A brief period where Gus was not directly supervised. Not unusual in rural environments. But here is what investigators quietly focus on. Even silence has patterns. And that day, those patterns did not match expectations. No crying reported. No calling out reported. No sudden noise remembered clearly. Just a gap. A gap that should have its sound inside it. So the question becomes heavier. If something happens in silence, does anyone realize it happened at all? Where distance changes everything. The Australian outback is not just empty land. It behaves differently. Sound travels strangely. Sight lines deceive the eye. Objects that seem close are often far. And things that are far can disappear in seconds. This is where investigators begin to face a difficult reality. In environments like this, loss does not look dramatic. It looks normal, until it is not. The first moment of something feels off. When a child could not be located within expected areas, concern did not start immediately. It built slowly, because in remote farms, children sometimes wander slightly out of sight. It happens. It has happened before. But then came the difference. The searching did not produce even a trace of direction. Not a sound. Not a footprint pattern that made sense. Not a simple, "he went this way," explanation. And suddenly, the normal explanation starts breaking apart. So investigators ask, when does "he might be nearby" turn into "something is wrong"? And who is the first person to notice that shift before it became a case? At first, it was informal. Family movement. Immediate checking of nearby areas. Calling out across land that seems to swallow voices. But the land did not answer. And that silence changed tone. Because silence can feel neutral until you need it to respond. Then it becomes something else. Something heavier. The area that should have given answers. The property was not small in emotional scale. It was large enough that searching it properly takes coordination. Dams. Shafts. Open ground. Structures scattered across distance. When authorities later expanded the search, they included water areas, mining shafts, aerial scanning zones. And yet, the strangest detail emerged. No clear evidence of wandering. No simple trail that matched expectations. So a new question formed. If he walked away, why does the land refuse to show the path? When effort becomes evidence. Hundreds of personnel eventually became involved. Police, emergency services, defense support, volunteers, indigenous trackers, air searches covering vast land. This was no longer a small search. It was a full operation. And yet the result remained emotionally unbearable. No physical confirmation of movement. No object. No clear direction. Nothing that explained where the day went. And investigators began to face something uncomfortable. Sometimes effort increases while clarity does not. Two theories start competing in silence. As the investigation expanded, two parallel ideas formed. The child wandered off naturally. Someone known to him may be involved. But here's where things get complicated. Neither theory had supporting physical evidence strong enough to close the gap. So instead of answers, there were branches of uncertainty. And each branch led to another question. If it was wandering, where's the trail? If it was involvement, where is the trace? Familiarity can hide blind spots. People who live in remote areas develop patterns. They know the land. They assume risk levels. They rely on familiarity. But investigators often look at familiarity differently, because familiarity can create blind spots. And blind spots are where missing time becomes invisible. So another question appears. Does knowing a place too, well, sometimes make you stop seeing it clearly? The moment cooperation changes everything. Later reports indicate something critical. A person associated with the property stopped cooperating with investigators. Not immediately, but during the investigation timeline. And this shift became important not because it proves anything, but because it changes direction. Because in missing person cases, cooperation often determines clarity. And lack of cooperation raises questions investigators cannot ignore. So the emotional tension shifts. What changed and when did it change? Clues or context? Authorities executed search warrants. Items were taken for examination. A vehicle, a motorcycle, electronic devices. At this point, nothing is publicly confirmed about meaning. But in investigative structure, this moment always signals something important. They're no longer just searching land. They are searching information. And that shift is never neutral. It always means something in the timeline does not fully add up yet. The discrepancies nobody can ignore. Investigators later mention inconsistencies. Not fully explained, not publicly detailed, but acknowledged. And this is where the emotional tone of the case changes again. Because inconsistencies do not mean guilt, but they do mean the story is not fully aligned yet. And when a story about a missing child is not aligned, Every missing detail feels heavier than it should. So the question becomes unavoidable. What part of the timeline does not fit the rest? A child, not a case file. It is easy in investigations to become focused on logistics, times, locations, movements, evidence. But at the center of this case is something simpler. A 4-year-old child who was last seen playing. And that contrast is what makes the situation emotionally heavy. Because no matter how complex the investigation becomes, the origin remains simple. A normal moment, a normal day, that stopped behaving normally. The search finds everything, except him. One of the most haunting outcomes is this. The search effort is massive. The coverage is wide. The coordination is intense. But what is missing is still missing. No clear physical confirmation emerges. And that creates a paradox investigators struggle with. When everything is searched, but nothing is found, what does that mean? Because absence of evidence can mean many things. But it never feels like nothing. It always feels like something is just out of reach. The final calm before the shift. Looking back at the timeline, investigators return again and again to the same point. The moment the child was last seen playing. Because everything after that point becomes uncertainty. And everything before that point feels like a normal day that did not warn anyone what it would become. That is what makes the setup so difficult to accept. Nothing about it looked like a beginning of tragedy. It looked like routine. And routine is what makes the shift so invisible at first. The day that didn't announce itself. There are cases where everything changes with noise. A scream, a crash, a sudden event. But this case begins differently. It begins with quiet, with distance, with a child playing in dirt under an open sky. And that is what investigators are left with. Not a moment that stood out, but a moment that blended in completely, until it was too late to see it as anything else. The moment everything changed was not loud. It did not arrive with panic. It did not arrive with chaos. It arrived as something far more dangerous in an investigation. A gap in time where nothing can be confirmed. And that gap is what investigators now refer to as the disappearance window. A short period, around 30 minutes. But in cases like this, time is not measured in minutes. It is measured in what should have been seen, but wasn't. And that is where the story begins to fracture. Because just before this window, everything was normal. And just after it, everything became uncertain. So the question becomes unavoidable. What really happened inside those 30 minutes? And even more disturbing, why does no one fully agree on what didn't happen? The moment before the gap. A child still visible, still safe. Gus was last seen in a familiar environment. A place he was supposed to know. A place where nothing unusual was expected. A child playing. No urgency. No warning. Just a normal rhythm of life in a remote landscape. But investigators always focus on something small here. Not just what was seen, but what was assumed to continue. Because assumptions are where investigations begin to weaken. And in this case, the assumption was simple. He is nearby. But assumptions do not leave evidence behind. And that becomes important very quickly. The 30-minute silence that shouldn't matter, but does. 30 minutes sounds short, almost harmless on paper. But here is what makes it critical. In that time, there was no confirmed sighting, no confirmed sound, no confirmed movement pattern. And suddenly, investigators are not looking at what happened. They're looking at what failed to be observed. So the question appears, how does a child vanish in a place where everything feels visible? And even more unsettling, what does visible even mean in the outback? The environment begins to complicate the timeline. Oak Park Station is not structured like a town. There are no fixed lines of sight, no consistent observation points, no continuous human presence. Distance behaves differently here. What feels close is often far. What feels open can still hide movement. And investigators begin to realize something important. The environment itself does not protect the timeline. It breaks it. So now the gap is no longer just time-based. It becomes space plus time plus uncertainty. And that combination is where clarity starts to disappear.
No witness doesn't mean nothing happened. One of the earliest conclusions in cases like this is often misunderstood. No witness does not mean nothing occurred. It only means nothing was confirmed by a human at that exact moment. And that distinction becomes critical here. Because in rural environments, people move between tasks. Visibility changes constantly. Attention is divided by work. Silence is normal, not unusual. So investigators are left with a difficult reality. The absence of witnesses does not explain the absence of the child. It only deepens the question. And that question begins to echo. If no one saw anything, what does that actually mean? When normal becomes panic. At some point after the 30-minute window, awareness shifts. Not instantly, but gradually. At first, it is routine checking. Then repeated checking. Then distance becomes concern. And concern becomes urgency. And urgency becomes something else entirely. The realization that the expected pattern is broken. Because children in familiar environments usually reappear quickly. They call out. They respond. They are found nearby. But this time, that pattern does not repeat. And when patterns fail, fear begins to form. The first search doesn't find what it expects. Initial searching focuses on nearby ground. The obvious areas. The familiar paths. The predictable zones. But something unexpected happens. The search does not immediately confirm direction. No clear footprint trail emerges. No simple path of movement appears. And this creates a deeper investigative concern. If movement happened normally, why does the land not record it? Because even simple movement leaves traces. Dust disturbed. Tracks formed. Direction implied. But here, the landscape stays uncooperative. And silence becomes evidence of confusion, not clarity. At first, the mindset is hopeful. The child is close. Just out of sight. Possibly resting. Possibly wandering. But hope depends on quick confirmation. And when confirmation does not come, hope begins to shift shape. It becomes urgency. Then uncertainty. Then fear. And finally, a question no one wants to fully say out loud. What if nearby is no longer true? That is the moment the disappearance window becomes more than time. It becomes emotional collapse of certainty. The search area expands, but clarity doesn't. As concern grows, search operations expand. Not just nearby ground, but broader terrain. Water points. Uneven land. Remote structures. Difficult terrain zones. This expansion is important. Because it signals a shift. From assumption to full uncertainty. But here is the paradox. The more the search expands, the less the narrative becomes clear. Because expansion does not automatically produce answers. It only increases the number of places where answers might not exist. And that creates a haunting feeling. If everything is searched and nothing is found, what does that mean? From missing moment to massive operation. The disappearance window does not stay a private concern for long. It grows. It pulls in resources. It escalates into a coordinated response involving hundreds of personnel. And this is where the story transitions naturally. Because the moment uncertainty becomes too large, it stops being a local search. It becomes a regional emergency operation. But even that escalation does not erase the original problem. The 30-minute gap remains unfilled. No matter how large the response becomes, the missing window still refuses to explain itself. Two explanations begin to compete inside the same gap. As investigators examine the timeline, two broad possibilities emerge. A child wandered away unnoticed. Someone familiar with the environment may be involved. But neither explanation fully closes the gap. Because both require something that is missing. A trace that matches the timeline. And without that trace, both theories remain incomplete. So instead of clarity, the case develops parallel uncertainty. Two possible truths. But neither fully proven. And the gap remains unchanged. The psychological weight of missing time. A missing person case is not only about location. It is about time that cannot be reconstructed. And in this case, the most difficult element is not distance. It is unknown duration. Because investigators can search land. They can follow evidence. They can reconstruct movement. But they cannot easily reconstruct a silent 30-minute gap with no anchors. That is what makes this window critical. Not its length, but its emptiness. The land becomes a witness that refuses to speak. In many investigations, the environment provides clues. But here, the environment behaves differently. It does not confirm movement. It does not deny it either. It simply offers no clear story. And that silence becomes more disturbing than noise. Because silence in an investigation is never neutral. It always feels like something is missing just beyond reach. So the question returns again. Did something happen that the land simply did not record? A child in the center of a broken timeline. It is easy to focus on numbers. 30-minute search zones distance coordinates. But at the center of it remains something simple. A child last seen playing. And that simplicity is what makes the timeline fracture feel so heavy. Because nothing about the beginning suggested an ending. And nothing about the gap explained what came after. So the mind keeps returning to the same point. The last moment before everything became uncertain. The disappearance window becomes the investigation's core. As time passes, investigators begin treating the gap not as a detail, but as the center of the case. Because every theory must pass through it. Every explanation must survive it. And every timeline must account for it. But the window remains unchanged. Unfilled. Unexplained. And that creates a pressure point in the investigation. If you cannot explain the gap, you cannot complete the story. And so the disappearance window does not remain isolated. It becomes the trigger point for everything that follows. Because once a timeline breaks, the response must expand. And that expansion leads directly into the next phase. The largest search operation in South Australia, public response. Where the story stops being about minutes and becomes about miles, manpower, and mounting urgency. But even there, one truth follows everything. The gap does not close. It only grows heavier with every unanswered question. When a case stops being about a single missing moment and becomes about an entire landscape, the world begins to respond differently. Not with quiet concern anymore, but with scale, with urgency, with bodies, machines, and coordination spread across land so large that even maps struggle to hold it clearly. And this is where the case of Gus Lamont shifts again. Because once the early search finds no trace, the question changes shape. If a child is not where he was last seen, how far can not found actually reach? And that question is what triggers something massive.
Something that no one in the community can ignore. The first expansion, when nearby, is no longer enough. At the beginning, the search is local. Close areas. Familiar ground. Places where a child might realistically wander. But silence changes everything. No voice responds. No movement is confirmed. No trace appears where it should. So the search expands. Slowly at first, then all at once. Because when a child does not reappear quickly in a remote environment, every nearby assumption becomes uncertain, and uncertainty forces distance to grow. So investigators begin widening the circle, not because they believe he is far, but because they can no longer prove he is near. The land stops behaving like a small place. Oak Park Station is not a compact environment. It is open, vast, uneven, and deceptive in scale. What looks reachable may take hours to physically cover. What looks empty may contain hidden terrain features. So as search teams arrive, a difficult truth appears. The land is too large to quickly clear, and that creates a psychological shift. Because suddenly, the problem is not just disappearance. It is scale, and scale does not offer quick answers. The air search begins when the sky becomes the only advantage. As ground searching expands, aerial support enters the operation. Helicopters, aircraft, drones, wide area scanning. From above, the expectation is simple. If something is visible, it should be seen. But visibility in the outback is not always honest. Shadows stretch, ground colors blend, small forms disappear into natural textures. And this leads to a disturbing realization. Even from above, the land can hide what you're looking for. So another question forms. If the sky cannot confirm movement, what else is left to search? The first emotional weight of no immediate find. Search operations often begin with hope. A quick recovery, a nearby discovery, a child found resting, hiding, or simply lost. But hours turn into days, and days begin to reshape expectation. Because no immediate result changes the emotional temperature of the entire operation. It moves from, "We will find him soon," to, "Why haven't we found anything yet?" And that shift is where concern becomes something heavier, something that starts to feel irreversible. Ground teams enter full coverage mode. Search teams spread across open land, rough terrain, water points, structural areas, inaccessible zones. Every location becomes a possibility. Every possibility becomes a priority. But there's a hidden difficulty no one talks about openly. Searching vast land is not just physical work, it is emotional endurance. Because every cleared area raises the same question. If he is not here, then where is he? And that question does not get easier with repetition. The dams and shafts create a new layer of fear. The search area includes dangerous terrain, water storage points, deep ground structures, abandoned or remote shafts. These locations change the emotional tone of the investigation, because now the search is not just about visibility. It is about possibility, and possibility introduces fear, because each checked location removes one hope, but does not replace it with certainty. So the emotional weight increases. Every not found is not closure. It is another unknown. The numbers begin to matter, but they don't bring comfort. Hundreds of personnel become involved. Police, emergency responders, military support, community volunteers, indigenous trackers with deep environmental knowledge. From a distance, the number sounds reassuring. It sounds like control. It sounds like progress. But inside the operation, numbers do not equal answers. They only represent effort. And effort without results creates a painful contradiction. The more people search, the more it feels like something is resisting discovery. The search becomes a map of everything checked and nothing confirmed. As operations expand, a strange pattern emerges. Large areas are systematically cleared, checked, reviewed, rechecked, but each confirmation leads to the same outcome. No sign of the child. And this creates a psychological inversion. Normally, searching reduces uncertainty. Here, searching increases it, because every cleared area removes a possibility, but does not reveal the truth. So the map begins to feel like a growing silence. The community response, when distance becomes personal, this is not just a police operation. It becomes a community event. Local people, volunteers, support teams, all contributing in some form. Because in missing child cases, distance disappears emotionally. Even people far away feel connected. But emotional involvement carries its own weight. Every hour without news feels longer than it should. Every update feels incomplete. Every silence feels heavier. And slowly, the entire community becomes part of the search emotionally, even if not physically. Two investigations begin running inside the same operation. As the search expands, investigators are not working on a single theory. They are working on multiple possibilities. A possible wandering scenario, a possible external involvement scenario. But neither explanation fits cleanly into the physical results, because no evidence strongly supports either direction. So the operation splits internally. One side searches for accident patterns. The other searches for intentional involvement patterns. But both face the same problem, the absence of physical confirmation. And that absence does not divide answers. It multiplies uncertainty. As time continues, a difficult emotional reality sets in. No discovery, no clear direction, no confirmed trace. And in missing person cases, nothing found yet is not neutral. It becomes emotionally loaded, because each passing hour changes expectations silently. From hope, to doubt, to fear that something is fundamentally unresolved. And that is where the emotional core of the operation begins to form, not in what is found, but in what refuses to appear. When scale turns into investigation pressure. At this stage, the search is no longer just about locating a child. It becomes about explaining why such a large-scale effort still produces no definitive result. Because when hundreds of people search vast land and still find nothing, the question stops being operational. It becomes investigative, and that is where the next shift happens. The first major twist, no trace found. But before that shift fully arrives, one truth remains central. The search is massive. The effort is undeniable, but the outcome is still incomplete. And that incompleteness is what begins to change the entire direction of the case. The most important detail is not what was found, but what was not. In most large searches, something eventually appears. A trace, a clue, a direction, a fragment of evidence. But here, the defining characteristic is absence. And absence does something unusual in investigations. It becomes louder the longer it remains unexplained. Because the human mind expects resolution. And when resolution does not arrive, it begins to question the structure of the entire timeline. So the operation leaves behind a difficult truth. The search was extensive, but the answer is still missing. And that missing answer is what leads directly into the next chapter. When a missing child case reaches its first real turning point, it is not always because something is found. Sometimes it is because nothing is found at all, and that nothing becomes the most disturbing result of all. Because in normal expectations, a search should produce something. A footprint, a piece of clothing, a direction, a small clue that confirms movement. But in this case, something unusual happens. The land gives nothing back. And that is where the first major twist begins. The expected pattern. What usually happens in these cases. In missing child investigations, especially in rural environments, there is a general pattern. Children are usually found within a limited radius. They wander. They get tired. They stop somewhere visible. They leave traces. That is the expectation investigators quietly carry. Even when hope is uncertain, patterns still guide search behavior. But here, something breaks that expectation early. Because as the search expands, the pattern does not appear. And that is where concern begins to change shape. The normal lost child logic starts failing. At first, everyone assumes the simplest explanation. He wandered off. He is nearby. He'll be found soon. But every hour without evidence weakens that assumption. Because wandering cases leave signs. Disturbed soil, direction trails, broken natural paths, nearby resting points. But here, there is no confirmed directional logic, no clear movement story, and investigators begin to face a difficult question. If he walked away, why does the environment not confirm it? No personal item, no physical trace. As search teams sweep the area, something critical is noticed. No clothing items are found. No personal objects appear. No clear trace of movement emerges. And this detail becomes emotionally heavy very quickly, because in real-world searches, something usually surfaces, even in difficult terrain, even in remote land. But here, the result is consistent. Nothing identifiable is recovered, and that changes everything, because no trace is not neutral. It is a signal that something does not fit expectations. The search radius expands and still finds nothing. The search does not stay small. It grows rapidly. Nearby land, wider rural zones, water areas, difficult terrain regions, aerial scanning coverage. Every expansion is logical. Every expansion is necessary. But every expansion leads to the same outcome. No confirmation of presence. And this creates a silent contradiction. The more they search, the less they understand. And that is where investigators begin to feel something unsettling. Absence is becoming consistent. The statistical reality, what should have happened. In many missing child cases, studies and field data show something important. Children are often located within a relatively short distance from their last known point, because they tend to stay within familiar terrain, avoid extreme movement, become physically limited quickly. seek shelter, or stop moving. So when time passes, the search radius becomes more predictable. But in this case, something breaks that statistical expectation. Because even after extended searching, the expected discovery zone remains empty. And that creates a difficult question. If the statistics don't match reality, what does reality mean here? The land was fully checked, but still feels incomplete. Authorities later confirm large areas were searched thoroughly, including dams, mine shafts, open land, aerial zones, surrounding remote areas. This is not a small effort. This is a large-scale operation, but the outcome remains unchanged. No confirmed evidence of wandering. And this is where the emotional tone shifts again, because cleared areas should bring relief. But here they bring something else, a deeper uncertainty, because clearing land without finding anything creates a haunting thought. If he is not here, then where is he? The emotional weight of scale, why big searches feel heavy. When hundreds of people are involved, police units, emergency responders, volunteers, aerial teams, specialized trackers, it creates an impression of control. But inside the operation, control is not the same as resolution, because effort does not guarantee answers. And here, effort becomes emotionally painful, because every passing hour of work leads to the same result. Still no trace. And that repetition begins to affect everyone involved, not just investigators, but the entire community watching closely. The most disturbing detail is not what was found, but what wasn't. In investigations like this, the absence of evidence can sometimes be explained. But here, absence becomes structured, consistent, repeating, no clothing, no direction, no confirmed movement. And that creates a psychological turning point, because absence stops feeling accidental and starts feeling meaningful. And investigators begin asking, can a child truly vanish without leaving any trace at all? That question does not have an easy answer, and that makes it even more unsettling. The breakdown of wandering theory. At this stage, one of the earliest explanations begins to weaken. The idea that Gus simply wandered off, because wandering usually leaves patterns. Gradual distance increase, visible movement direction, physical indicators of travel. But none of these patterns are confirmed. So the theory begins to lose strength, not because it is impossible, but because it is incomplete. And in investigations, incomplete theories cannot close cases. The normal explanation starts competing with something else. As wandering theory weakens, another possibility becomes unavoidable, that something more complex may have occurred, not because evidence proves it, but because the absence of evidence demands explanation. And now investigators face two competing realities. A simple disappearance with no traces, a scenario that does not match natural patterns. But neither theory fully fits the physical findings. So the case enters a strange phase. Multiple explanations, but no confirming evidence for any. Search effort versus silence. There's a powerful contrast here. On one side, massive search operations, coordinated teams, advanced equipment, extensive land coverage. On the other side, silence, no trace, no confirmation, no resolution. And that contrast becomes emotionally heavy for everyone involved. Because the human mind expects balance. Effort should lead to outcome. But here, effort leads to more silence. The investigation enters a psychological pressure phase. As time passes, investigators are not only dealing with geography anymore. They're dealing with uncertainty pressure, because every cleared area increases expectation for the next one. But each new area produces the same result, nothing. And that repetition creates a psychological loop. Search, no find, expand, no find, repeat. And the loop becomes emotionally exhausting because it refuses to break. Eventually, investigators must adapt, because when physical evidence does not provide direction, they must rely on theory. And theory is where interpretation begins. So the investigation moves forward into its next phase. The investigation splits into three theories. But this transition is not smooth. It is forced by absence, because no trace found is not an ending. It is a disruption, and that disruption pushes the case into deeper uncertainty. The most important discovery is that nothing fits cleanly. At this stage, one truth becomes unavoidable. Every normal explanation is missing something, and every alternative explanation lacks confirmation. So the investigation reaches a difficult emotional point. Not confusion because of too much evidence, but confusion because of too little. And that is what makes this twist powerful. Because the most unsettling result is not discovery. It is the complete absence of anything that makes the timeline feel complete. When a missing child case reaches this stage, something important happens inside the investigation. It stops moving in one direction, and instead it breaks, not physically, but logically, into different possible truths. And that is exactly what happens here. Because when no trace is found, and no single explanation fits, the investigation is forced to divide itself into three separate theories, three different paths, three different ways of understanding the same silence. And none of them fully complete the picture. The moment everything splits, when one truth is no longer enough. At first, investigators try to hold a single explanation, a simple one, a clean one, something that fits the land, the timeline, the silence. But the more they search, the more that single explanation weakens, because nothing confirms it fully. No trace supports it completely. No evidence closes it. So the investigation does something unavoidable. It splits, not because they want it to, but because reality refuses to stay in one shape. And that is where the three theories begin. The wandering off explanation. This is always the first and most natural assumption in rural missing child cases. A child playing, a brief moment of no supervision, a large open environment. So the idea forms. He wandered off. Simple, familiar, comforting in its simplicity. But investigators do not stop at assumptions. They test it against reality. What would wandering normally look like? In a typical wandering case, you expect gradual movement away from origin, visible direction of travel, physical traces like footprints, eventual discovery within a limited range. This is what search teams expect. This is what experience tells them to look for. But here, something does not match. Because even after extensive searching, there is no confirmed directional trail, no clear pattern of movement, no physical confirmation of a child traveling through the terrain. And that becomes the first crack in the theory. The land should have recorded something. In open environments like this, the land usually keeps a memory. Dust, disturbed grass, bent soil, compressed, natural movement patterns. But in this case, that memory feels missing. And investigators begin to ask a difficult question. If he walked away, why is there no story left behind in the ground? And that question does not have an easy answer. So wandering off starts to weaken. Not fully rejected, but no longer strong enough to stand alone. The abduction explanation. As wandering theory becomes uncertain, another possibility emerges. More serious, more complex, and more difficult to prove. Abduction. A sudden removal. A forceful or deliberate act. Something outside normal natural movement. But investigators approach this carefully, because not all environments support this theory equally. And Oak Park Station is extremely remote. The challenge of the abduction theory. For abduction to occur unnoticed in such a place, several conditions must align. Timing must be precise. Access must be possible. Movement must be fast. No immediate witness should appear. But the remoteness of the area creates a contradiction. It is isolated, but not easily explainable in terms of unnoticed entry and exit. So investigators test it carefully, and what they find is important. No clear external entry evidence. Search operations and analysis do not reveal. Forced access signs. Clear external movement traces. Confirmed intrusion patterns. And this creates tension in the theory, because while abduction is possible in theory, it lacks supporting physical direction. so it does not fully stabilize as an explanation. Not completely rejected, but not fully supported either. And that leaves a gap, a dangerous one, because now two theories exist, and neither is complete. Someone known to him, and then comes the most sensitive theory, the one that shifts focus inward, not outside the property, not into strangers, but into proximity, familiarity, access without suspicion, someone known to him. This theory does not emerge from assumption. It emerges from investigative inconsistencies mentioned in reports, from cooperation changes, from timeline gaps, from missing clarity in movement reconstruction. Why investigators consider this possibility? In many missing child cases, one important factor is considered: who had access during the critical time window? Because in remote environments, access is limited, movement is controlled, people present are known, interactions are closely tied. So investigators look closely at internal presence, not as accusation, but as possibility. Cooperation changes become important. One detail becomes critical in this phase. A person associated with the property stops cooperating with authorities. This does not automatically mean guilt, but it changes investigative direction, because cooperation often helps clarify timelines, and lack of cooperation creates missing pieces.
So investigators face a new problem. The timeline becomes harder to reconstruct from inside, and that deepens suspicion layers, not toward certainty, but toward unresolved questions. The three theories now exist together, but none complete the story. At this stage, the investigation holds three possible explanations: wandering off, abduction by unknown person, involvement of someone known. But here is the crucial issue. None of them fully matches the physical evidence. And that creates instability, because normally, one theory begins to dominate. But here, they all remain incomplete. So instead of narrowing clarity, the case becomes more divided. The abduction theory weakens under geography. Even though abduction is considered, the geography challenges it. Because remote location, large open land, delayed discovery window, lack of physical intrusion evidence, all of these reduce certainty. So this theory remains possible, but not strongly supported. And that pushes investigators back toward internal possibilities. At this point, something subtle happens. The case stops feeling like a simple search, and starts feeling like a failure to reconstruct reality. Because every theory tries to explain the same missing result. No trace. And that becomes the emotional center. Not what happened, but why nothing can be confirmed. One theory slowly gains more weight, but not proof. As investigators compare all three theories, one begins to feel slightly more consistent with available inconsistencies. Not because it is proven, but because it fits gaps better than the others. The internal involvement theory, because it aligns with timeline uncertainties, cooperation withdrawal, investigative discrepancies. But even this theory does not have direct confirmation, so it remains a working direction, not a conclusion. No theory feels complete. This is the hardest part of the investigation, because people expect answers to move toward clarity. But here, every path has missing pieces. So the emotional effect is heavy. Wandering feels incomplete. Abduction lacks evidence. Internal involvement lacks proof. And that creates a disturbing feeling. The truth may exist, but not in a fully visible form yet. The investigation becomes a process of eliminating comfort, not finding answers. Each theory removes comfort, but does not replace it with certainty. So investigators are left with something unusual. Not a single strong narrative, but three fragile ones. And that is more difficult than having none. Because now the mind keeps shifting between possibilities, without resolution. As the investigation progresses, something becomes unavoidable. The problem is no longer just which theory is correct. The problem becomes why none of them fully fit the timeline. And that realization pushes the case into its next phase. White right pointing backhand index the internal inconsistencies. where investigators stop choosing between theories and start questioning the structure of the timeline itself. The most unsettling truth. At the end of this stage, one truth remains. It is not that investigators lack theories. It is that the evidence does not fully support any single one. And that creates a deeper emotional weight. Because uncertainty is no longer temporary. It becomes structural. And that is what leads directly into the next chapter, where the investigation turns inward and begins to question itself. There is a moment in every serious investigation when the problem is no longer the missing person. It becomes the missing clarity. Because at first, everything feels simple. A child was last seen here, a search began there, and everyone expects the story to connect cleanly. But in this case, the connections begin to break. Not loudly, but quietly. Inside the details. Inside the timeline. Inside the words that were once considered certain. And that is where the investigation changes direction completely. Because now, the question is no longer, where is Gus? It becomes, what part of the timeline is not fully true as understood? When small details stop matching perfectly, investigators begin by rechecking everything. Not because they suspect wrongdoing, but because the outcome does not match expectations. The search was large. The effort was massive. The environment was fully covered. Yet nothing was found. And that alone forces a return to earlier statements. Because when results don't match reality, the timeline itself must be re-examined. So every detail is reviewed again. Every movement. Every statement. Every remembered moment. And slowly, small cracks begin to appear. Not in truth, but in consistency. The timeline stops feeling like one straight line. At first, the timeline looks simple. Child playing, short absence, concern begins, search starts. But when investigators recheck it carefully, it stops feeling smooth. There are moments that do not align perfectly. Not major contradictions, but small gaps. Small mismatches in timing. Small differences in recollection. And those small differences matter more than expected. Because in missing child cases, time is the only structure holding everything together. And if time becomes unclear, everything else becomes uncertain too. The weight of discrepancies identified. At one point, official language mentions something important. Discrepancies were identified. This does not mean guilt. It does not mean conclusion. But it does mean the information does not fully align. And that creates a shift in tone. Because discrepancy is not a dramatic word. But in investigations, it carries heavy meaning. It means something does not fit the expected pattern. Something needs rechecking. Something may have been misunderstood. And so investigators go back again. Memory becomes an unstable source. One of the hardest parts of early investigation is this. People remember events under stress differently. Time feels shorter. Details blur. Small actions become unclear. So when investigators re-interview or recheck accounts, they are not just checking facts. They are checking human memory under pressure. And here, that becomes important. Because even slight differences in memory create questions about timing. And timing is everything in this case. So another question appears. Is the inconsistency in the event, or in how it was remembered? And that question has no simple answer. When the past is rebuilt step by step, investigators do something critical at this stage. They reconstruct. Not once, but repeatedly. They go back to movements around the homestead, last confirmed sighting, immediate response timing, search initiation sequence. Each step is checked again, not because they expect a new event, but because they are trying to confirm stability. But instead of stability, they find small shifts. And those shifts create tension. Because when reconstruction does not fully match itself, it means something is still unaccounted for.
The silence after the disappearance becomes part of the inconsistency. At first, silence is just absence. No sound, no trace, no signal. But now investigators begin to see silence differently. Because silence is not just nothing happened. It is also nothing was recorded. And that becomes part of the inconsistency problem. Because if the timeline is correct, something should exist in that silence. But there is nothing. So investigators face a difficult idea. Is the gap in evidence normal or meaningful? And that question deepens the investigation. When cooperation becomes a timeline factor, another important detail emerges during this phase. Changes in cooperation from individuals involved in the environment. Again, not treated as automatic suspicion, but as a timeline issue, because cooperation affects clarity. When information is shared consistently, timelines become clearer. When information changes or stops, timelines become harder to reconstruct. And here, that matters, because investigators are trying to rebuild exact moments. And any missing clarity becomes a structural problem. So the timeline becomes not just incomplete, but unstable. The investigation stops trusting single versions of events. At this stage, investigators no longer rely on one version of events. Instead, they compare multiple versions. And this comparison creates another issue. No single version fully explains everything. Each version explains part of the timeline, but leaves another part unclear. So investigators begin layering interpretations, not to choose truth, but to test consistency. And the result is unsettling. No version fully closes the gap. When facts stop feeling comfortable, there's a psychological change here that is not often spoken about. When inconsistencies appear, certainty begins to weaken, not emotionally at first, but structurally, because people expect investigations to become clearer over time. But here, clarity becomes more fragile, and that creates a quiet emotional impact. If the timeline is uncertain, then every earlier assumption must also be reevaluated. And that realization is heavy, because it means nothing is fully settled yet. The investigation begins re-questioning its own foundation. Now investigators do something unusual. They do not just review evidence. They review interpretation. They ask, did we assume timing correctly? Did we interpret movement correctly? Did we assign meaning too early? And this is where the turning point becomes clear. Because now the investigation is no longer just searching outward. It is searching inward for structure errors, for missing alignment, for overlooked details. And that creates a deeper level of uncertainty. The growing pressure of not fully aligned. As inconsistencies accumulate, the investigation does not collapse, but it becomes more cautious, more precise, more sensitive to detail, because every small mismatch could matter, and every rechecked statement could change interpretation. So investigators move carefully, not because they are confused, but because they now understand. Small details can affect the entire direction of a case. The timeline stops feeling linear. One of the most important realizations emerges here. The timeline may not be as linear as originally assumed, not in a dramatic sense, but in how it is understood. Because gaps in memory plus gaps in evidence plus gaps in confirmation create a layered uncertainty. And that means the case is no longer a straight sequence of events. It becomes a structure of overlapping possibilities, and that is much harder to resolve. When inconsistency leads to suspect focus. At this stage, investigators reach a critical threshold, because inconsistencies alone do not solve cases, but they do guide direction. And when enough inconsistencies accumulate, attention naturally narrows, not to conclusion, but to focus areas. And that is where the next phase begins. The suspect emerges where uncertainty begins to concentrate. And the investigation moves from confusion to focused attention on one developing lead. The most difficult realization. The most important discovery at this stage is not a suspect. It is this. The story does not fully align with itself yet. And that is what makes this turning point powerful. Because it shows that the case is not just about missing presence, but about missing clarity inside the timeline itself. And until that is resolved, nothing can fully close. There are moments in every investigation that change everything. Not because new evidence suddenly appears, but because old information starts pointing in a direction that cannot be ignored anymore. And in this case, that moment arrives quietly, without drama, without warning, but with serious weight. Because for the first time, the investigation begins to narrow around one specific person inside the environment where everything began. And that changes the entire story. Early in the investigation, one point is made very clearly. The parents are not suspects. That statement is important. It creates emotional stability. It helps the public understand where attention is not going. But investigations do not stay still. They evolve. And as more information is reviewed, as timelines are rebuilt, as inconsistencies are examined again, something subtle begins to form. Not a conclusion, not an accusation, but a focus shift. Because investigators begin to see that not all individuals in the environment carry the same level of clarity in their movements. And that difference becomes important. The search warrant changes everything without saying it out loud. When authorities execute a search warrant at the property, it is not just a routine step. It is a turning point in investigative seriousness. Because a search warrant means investigators need physical confirmation. Digital devices may hold missing answers. Movement patterns may be reconstructed. Timelines may be verified against reality. And when items are taken, it is not about what is found immediately. It is about what those items might reveal later. A vehicle, a motorcycle, electronic devices. At first glance, they're ordinary. But in an investigation like this, ordinary objects become timeline carriers because they can show where someone went when they moved, what activity happened, and whether the story stays consistent. And now the investigation has something new. Not answers, but data waiting to be interpreted. Cooperation starts to change. One of the most important turning points is not loud. It is gradual, a shift in cooperation. At first, individuals in the environment are described as assisting investigators, sharing information, helping establish movements, clarifying timelines. But then something changes. One person stops cooperating, not suddenly in a dramatic way, but in a way that stands out to investigators. Because cooperation is not just helpful, it is part of consistency checking. And when cooperation stops, a gap appears, not just in communication, but in understanding. And investigators notice it immediately, because silence in an investigation is never neutral. It becomes part of the pattern. Silence becomes a data point. At this stage, silence is no longer treated as absence. It becomes something measurable. Investigators ask, what changed before cooperation stopped? What was being discussed during that time? What information was already provided? What questions remained unanswered? And slowly, silence becomes connected to structure. Not emotion, not suspicion, structure. Because every investigation relies on flow of information. And when that flow breaks, the structure becomes uneven. An uneven structure always draws attention. The key phrase that changes direction: inconsistencies identified. There is a moment in official communication that changes everything quietly. Inconsistencies and discrepancies were identified. This does not mean guilt. It does not mean conclusion. But it does mean the information does not align perfectly anymore. And that is enough to change focus. Because in investigative work, small inconsistencies are never ignored. They are studied because they often connect to missing pieces. And now the question becomes, why do parts of the timeline not fully align? And more importantly, where exactly does the alignment break? The investigation stops accepting single-source truth. At this point, investigators stop relying on one version of events. Instead, they compare initial statements, reconstructed timelines, physical search outcomes, environmental possibilities, and something unusual happens. No single version fully explains everything. Each version explains part of the situation, but not the whole. And that creates a new problem. If no single explanation is complete, then multiple explanations must be layered together. and that increases complexity instead of reducing it. When one person becomes relevant, now comes the most sensitive shift in the entire case. A person who lives at the property becomes a focus of interest, not because of assumption, not because of narrative pressure, but because of investigative narrowing. This happens when timeline gaps cluster around certain movements. Cooperation changes affect clarity. Seized materials require explanation. Inconsistencies remain unresolved. And suddenly, one individual stands closer to the center of unresolved questions, not as a conclusion, but as a point of focus. And that is what changes the emotional tone of the case. Focus does not mean conclusion. This is important. Investigative focus is not the same as accusation. It is not a final judgment. It is a narrowing of attention. Because investigators must prioritize what cannot be verified, what cannot be fully explained, what requires clarification, what still contains gaps. And in this case, one person's involvement in the environment creates more unanswered areas than others. So attention naturally shifts, not dramatically, but inevitably, when a case stops feeling open-ended. At the beginning, everything feels like uncertainty. A missing child, a large search, a remote environment, many possibilities. But now, the uncertainty starts to compress, because focus creates direction, and direction removes randomness. And that is when the emotional weight changes, because now the case is no longer just about disappearance. It becomes about what is still not fully explained inside the timeline. And that realization is difficult, because it removes the comfort of pure uncertainty and replaces it with structured questions. The evidence does not point directly, it points indirectly. One of the most important aspects of this stage is this. There is no single object that solves everything. Instead, there are patterns. Patterns in movement timing, cooperation changes, seized material relevance, timeline gaps, inconsistent overlaps. And patterns are harder to interpret than direct evidence, because patterns require reconstruction, not observation. And reconstruction takes time, and careful thinking, and repeated review. A case that stops feeling like a simple disappearance. At this stage, something shifts in how the case feels. It no longer feels like a child went missing and search is ongoing. It starts feeling like a complex timeline is being reconstructed to understand what truly happened in a small, isolated environment. And that shift is subtle, but powerful, because it changes expectations, it changes interpretation, and it changes emotional response. The investigation now has a central pressure point. Every investigation eventually forms a pressure point, a place where questions accumulate, clarity decreases, focus increases, uncertainty concentrates. And in this case, that pressure point forms around a person who is physically present in the environment, and whose movements, statements, and cooperation timeline become critical to understanding unresolved gaps. Not because the case is solved, but because this is where the missing clarity appears to converge. And now the investigation enters its next phase. Because once a suspect focus emerges, the next step is not conclusion. It is examination. Everything becomes deeper. Seized evidence is reanalyzed. Timelines are rebuilt with precision. Inconsistencies are mapped carefully. Digital and physical traces are reviewed again. And this leads directly into the next chapter. Back-end index pointing right, the search warrant and seized evidence, where attention moves from who is being examined to what evidence begins to speak more clearly under pressure. The most important shift of all, the most important realization at this stage is not about guilt or innocence. It is this. The investigation is no longer wide. It is focused. And once an investigation becomes focused, every detail starts to matter differently. Even silence, even absence, even timing. And that is where everything begins to tighten toward the next reveal. There is a point in every investigation where words are no longer enough. Statements slow down. Assumptions stop carrying weight. And everything shifts toward something more solid, something physical. Because when uncertainty grows too large, authorities do not look for explanations anymore. They look for evidence that can be held, tested, and confirmed. And that is exactly where this case enters a new phase. A phase that does not speak in theories, but in objects, in traces, in silent materials that may hold answers no one has heard yet. The moment the investigation changes direction, a search warrant is not just paperwork. It is a decision that says, we need to look deeper than what has already been shared. It is not based on public pressure. It is not based on speculation. It is based on the idea that somewhere inside the environment, there may be something important that has not yet been understood. So investigators move forward, quietly, carefully, but with full authority. And once that step is taken, the case is no longer only about missing presence. It becomes about physical truth. When a home stops feeling like just a home, the search warrant is executed at the property. And in moments like this, familiar places change meaning. A home becomes a map. A yard becomes a timeline. A vehicle becomes a movement record. A device becomes a memory holder. Because investigators are not looking at objects the way ordinary people do. They are looking at where it was used, when it was active, what it might connect to, what it might confirm or contradict. And suddenly, every object becomes part of a bigger story, a story that is still incomplete. When objects become questions during the search, several items are taken for examination. A vehicle, a motorcycle, electronic devices. At first glance, these are ordinary possessions. But in an investigation like this, nothing is ordinary anymore, because each item now carries a question. Where did it go? When was it last used? Who controlled it? What movement does it explain? And more importantly, does it match the timeline that has been established so far? Because if even one detail does not align, it can shift understanding completely. The evidence does not speak immediately. There is a misunderstanding many people have about investigations. They think evidence immediately reveals answers. But in reality, evidence is silent at first. It must be collected, preserved, analyzed, compared, interpreted, and only then does it begin to speak. So at this stage, nothing is confirmed. Nothing is concluded. Everything is waiting. And that waiting creates tension, because the absence of answers is itself a signal. Something important may still be hidden inside these objects. When routine becomes serious, when items are removed from a location, it creates a shift in atmosphere. Not because guilt is assumed, but because seriousness is confirmed. It tells everyone involved. This case has moved beyond surface-level investigation, and that alone changes how every earlier detail is viewed. Because now investigators must ask, why these items? Why now? What triggered this level of examination? And the answers are not simple. They come from patterns, not headlines. Digital devices become silent witnesses. Among the seized items, electronic devices carry special importance because they do not forget easily. They store timestamps, communication logs, movement indicators, usage patterns, but they do not reveal information immediately. They must be carefully extracted, carefully interpreted, carefully matched against known timelines. And that means the truth inside them is delayed, which creates a strange situation where the most important answers are already in possession, but not yet accessible. And that delay builds pressure quietly. Why vehicles matter more than they seem. A vehicle is not just transportation. In investigations like this, it becomes a movement map. It can show where it traveled, when it moved, how long it stayed inactive, weather patterns match statements. And even when nothing obvious is found, its absence of irregularity can still be meaningful. Because sometimes what is not present is just as important as what is. And investigators understand that deeply. So every movement record becomes part of a reconstruction process. The investigation begins comparing reality versus statement. At this stage, something subtle begins to happen. Investigators start comparing what is said versus what physical data suggests. And this comparison is where complexity grows. because statements are human memory. But physical evidence is time-based reality. And when the two do not fully match, questions begin to form, not accusations, just questions. And those questions begin to guide the next steps of the investigation. The silence after the warrant. A critical phase begins. After the search is completed, there is a silence. But it is not calm silence. It is analytical silence. Because now everything depends on lab results, forensic analysis, data, extraction, timeline comparison. And during this period, nothing is visible to the outside world. But inside the investigation, everything is active. Because this is where raw material becomes insight. And insight becomes direction. Evidence begins to redefine earlier assumptions. One of the most important moments in any investigation is this: when new evidence forces old understanding to be rechecked. Because even small findings can adjust timelines, change assumptions, highlight overlooked details, question earlier interpretations. And that is why seized evidence is never treated lightly. It is not just collected, it is studied repeatedly. Because each review can reveal something new, something missed before, something subtle, something important. When objects start carrying emotional weight, there is also a human side to this stage. Because objects connected to a case like this are not just technical items. They become emotionally heavy, not because of what they are, but because of what they might represent. A moment, a movement, a missing connection. And that emotional weight affects everyone involved in the investigation differently. Because it reminds them, this is not just data. This is a real-life situation still waiting for resolution. The case becomes more focused without becoming clear. At this point, something paradoxical happens. The investigation becomes more focused, but not more resolved. Because focus reduces possibilities, but does not automatically create answers. So investigators now operate inside a narrower field. Verified timeline segments, confirmed evidence locations, inconsistent movement points, unexplained gaps. And inside that narrowed space, they search for alignment. But alignment is still missing. From evidence to system-level shift. As the analysis continues, a bigger realization begins to form. This is no longer a routine missing person inquiry. The level of investigation, the depth of evidence handling, and the complexity of inconsistencies all point toward a system-level escalation. And that leads directly into the next phase, the major crime declaration, where the entire case framework changes, and the investigation enters its most serious category. The most important truth of this stage, the most important realization is not what was found. It is what the search warrant represents. The moment the investigation stopped relying on words and started relying on physical reality. And once that shift happens, there's no going back to simplicity, only deeper analysis, deeper questioning, and deeper search for what still does not fully make sense.
There is a moment in every investigation when everything changes its category. Not the facts, not the location, not even the timeline, but the level of seriousness. And when that happens, the entire system around the case shifts. Quietly, officially, permanently. This is that moment. Because the case is no longer treated as a standard missing person investigation. It is now elevated into a major crime investigation framework. And that changes everything. The shift you cannot see, but can feel. When a case is declared a major crime, nothing immediately looks different from the outside. There is no visible transformation, no sudden discovery, no public resolution. But inside the system, everything reorders. Because now, resources increase. Investigation authority expands. Specialized units take control. Timelines are re-evaluated under stricter standards. And what was once a search operation becomes a full-scale forensic investigation, not based on hope, but based on seriousness of uncertainty. The case stops being treated as possibly lost. At earlier stages, there is always one simple assumption. Maybe the child wandered off, maybe they are still within search range, maybe survival scenarios apply. But once a case becomes a major crime, that baseline assumption weakens. Because authorities must now consider possibilities beyond accidental disappearance, not as conclusions, but as investigative necessity. And that is a huge psychological shift, because it changes how every detail is reinterpreted, even familiar ones. When investigation becomes structured pressure, a specialized task force is assigned. Task Force Horizon. This is not just a name. It represents structure, coordination, focused responsibility, and multi-layer investigation capability. Because now the case is no longer handled as a local search effort. It is handled as a complex investigative system. And that system has one goal: reduce uncertainty through controlled analysis. Not assumptions, not expectations, but verified progression. Two theories are now treated as equal starting points. At this stage, investigators officially work with two parallel directions. An unknown abduction scenario. Involvement of someone known within the environment. Neither is confirmed. Neither is dismissed. Both are kept active. And this is important, because keeping both theories alive means the investigation is still open in interpretation, but structured in approach. And that balance creates tension, because every new detail must now be tested against two possibilities, not one. The emotional weight of no evidence of wandering off. One of the most important statements in this phase is subtle but powerful. Search efforts found no evidence of wandering off. This does not mean certainty, but it removes simplicity. Because in missing child cases, wandering scenarios are often the most expected explanation. But when search coverage is extensive, and no trace is found, that expectation weakens. And something more complex takes its place. Not conclusion, but uncertainty with direction. Scale of search becomes a psychological turning point. The search effort is massive. Hundreds of personnel, aerial coverage, ground search expansion, specialist trackers, community involvement, multiple terrain types. At this scale, the expectation naturally becomes something should have been found. Even small evidence, even indirect trace. But when nothing appears, the absence itself becomes meaningful, because it challenges probability, and introduces a difficult question. How does nothing remain after such a large search effort? That question does not accuse anyone, but it deepens the investigation. When geography becomes a variable, search efforts extend beyond the main property into nearby national areas. This matters because it expands the possible movement radius. But it also introduces complexity, larger terrain, natural obstacles, unpredictable environments, reduced visibility areas. And that means absence of evidence becomes harder to interpret. Because nature can hide things, but it cannot explain everything. And investigators must separate what is hidden from what is missing. No evidence becomes the most important statement. In most cases, evidence drives conclusions. But here, the absence of evidence becomes equally important. Because investigators must now consider, was there simply no trace? Or was the trace removed or never present in expected form? This is not a conclusion. It is a structural question. And it shifts the investigation deeper into analysis mode. Because now they are not just searching. They are interpreting absence. Two paths running at once. The investigation is now officially split into two parallel lines. Unknown external involvement. Known internal connection possibility. These are not competing theories. They are parallel frameworks. Each is tested against timeline data, physical evidence, environmental logic, behavioral consistency. And each time new information arrives, both frameworks are tested again. This creates constant re-evaluation and constant uncertainty refinement. The case becomes about structure, not just event. At this stage, something important changes. The investigation is no longer just about what happened. It becomes about How events connect together. Because individual pieces alone do not explain everything, but structure might. So investigators focus on sequence alignment, movement consistency, communication gaps, physical vs reported timing. And this shift is critical, because structure reveals what isolated facts cannot. When official language becomes heavier than emotion, official statements in this phase carry quiet weight. Tragic circumstances, distressing situation, ongoing determination, community impact. These are not dramatic words, but in context, they feel heavy, because they acknowledge uncertainty without resolution. And that creates emotional pressure not through shock, but through continuation without closure. The investigation gains direction, but loses simplicity. This is the paradox of the system shift. Before, the case was broad, uncertain, and open-ended. Now, the case is structured, focused, and categorized. But simplicity is gone, because every detail must now be tested against a formal investigative framework. And that framework does not allow easy assumptions. It demands verification, consistency, reconstruction. And that makes the case heavier, not clearer, just more defined in its complexity, where all questions begin to converge. As investigation expands in structure, a silent center begins to form, not a conclusion, but a convergence point, where timeline gaps, evidence absence, suspect focus, environmental uncertainty, all begin to overlap. And that overlap is where attention naturally moves next. Because investigations always move toward convergence, even when answers are not ready yet.
Now the investigation stands at a point where structure is defined, focus is narrowed, but answers are still not complete. And when that happens, the next stage is not procedural. It becomes interpretive, where investigators and observers both begin to see direction forming, even without confirmation. And that leads into the next phase, the most disturbing conclusion direction, where uncertainty begins to take shape, and every detail starts pointing toward the same silent possibility. The major crime declaration is not a conclusion. It is a transformation, because it tells us something critical. The case is no longer about what was lost, but about what must now be proven. And once a system reaches that stage, every detail becomes heavier. Every silence becomes louder, and every unanswered question becomes more important than ever before. There's a point in every missing child case where silence becomes louder than facts. Not because nothing is happening, but because everything that was expected to be found simply does not exist anymore. And in this case, that silence begins here. After the inconsistencies were noticed in earlier statements and movements around Gus Lamont's last known time, investigators did not immediately move toward conclusion. They moved backward, not forward, because when truth feels unstable, every earlier moment becomes suspicious again. And that is where the investigation starts to change direction in a way nobody expected. At Oak Park Station, the search continued with full force. Not small teams, not limited scanning, but coordinated ground, air, and specialist operations across extremely large and difficult terrain. 3 dams, 6 mine shafts, and vast open land that stretches further than most people can imagine. But what makes this stage disturbing is not the scale of the search. It is the result, because after all of that effort, nothing personal to Gus was found. No clothing, no object, no clear sign of movement, no natural trace that usually appears in a wandering case. And this is where the first real doubt begins to form inside the investigation. Because in missing child cases, even in the worst environments, something is usually left behind. A clue, a direction, a fragment of truth. But here, there's nothing that connects the child to any path outward. And that absence starts to feel unnatural, almost too clean. So investigators begin asking a difficult question. Not loudly, not publicly, but internally. What does it mean when a child disappears and the environment gives nothing back? Because in most remote area cases, the land itself becomes a witness. Tracks fade, but they exist. Objects get lost, but they are found. Even wildlife interaction leaves signs. But here, the land stayed silent, and that silence begins to reshape the entire investigation mindset. This is where the second shift begins. Authorities had already expanded search zones far beyond the immediate area, and still, the result remained the same. No confirmation of wandering, no confirmation of accidental movement, no physical trail strong enough to support a natural disappearance theory. And slowly, one idea begins to weaken inside the official assessment. The idea that Gus simply walked away. Because if that was true, something should have followed him. Something always does. Now the investigation is no longer looking at just distance. It starts looking at timing, behavior, human presence. And this is where earlier statements become important again. Because inconsistencies were already identified in relation to movement around the property at the time of disappearance. Not accusations, not conclusions, just gaps. Small gaps at first. But now those gaps feel larger under new scrutiny. Because when nothing is found outside, the focus naturally returns inside. And inside that space, another layer of tension begins to grow. A person who lived on the property had initially cooperated with investigators, provided information, engaged with questioning, helped outline movement timelines. But later, that cooperation changed. And that change is not treated lightly. Because in investigations like this, cooperation is often the first bridge to understanding. And when that bridge is withdrawn, investigators are left with only silence on the other side. This is the moment where the case stops feeling like a search operation and starts feeling like a reconstruction effort. Because now, every detail must be rebuilt from memory, statements, and physical evidence that does not fully connect. And when connections don't form naturally, investigators begin to test structure instead of stories. They ask, does this timeline actually hold? Does this movement make sense under conditions of the day? Does the sequence of events align with physical reality? And slowly, the investigation begins to tighten. Not outward, but inward. Because something important has now been established. The environment does not explain the disappearance. And when environment fails, human factors become the remaining focus. Not as conclusion, but as necessity. Because the system must eliminate what cannot be supported before moving forward. And this is where emotional weight begins to build outside the investigation. For the community, for the family, for everyone waiting for an answer that refuses to form clearly. And in the middle of all this, there is one detail that quietly shapes everything. Despite massive searching efforts, there is still no single confirmed trace of Gus outside the original point of disappearance. That means every direction leads back to the same starting place, the same silence, the same unanswered gap, and that is not normal in large-scale missing child searches. It creates pressure, not emotional pressure alone, but investigative pressure, because when every path leads back to zero, the question changes from, where did he go? To, what actually happened at the starting point? And that is the moment everything begins to shift, because now the investigation is no longer just about location. It is about interpretation. And interpretation can divide even the strongest cases into multiple possible truths, which leads directly into what comes next. The investigation splits into three theories, because when evidence does not point outward, it begins to split inward, into possibilities, into competing explanations, into versions of truth that do not agree with each other. And once that happens, the case is no longer one story. It becomes three. At this stage of the investigation, something begins to change that no one can ignore anymore. It is not a new clue. It is not a new witness. It is something far more uncomfortable. It is the absence of closure. Because even after massive searches, after official declarations, after expanding investigations, the truth is still not forming into one clear direction. And when that happens in a missing child case, silence stops feeling like emptiness. It starts feeling like pressure. And that is the moment everything begins to shift. Because now, the investigation is no longer just about location. It is about interpretation. And interpretation can divide even the strongest cases into multiple possible truths, which leads directly into what comes next. The investigation splits into 3 theories. Because when evidence does not point outward, it begins to split inward, into possibilities, into competing explanations, into versions of truth that do not agree with each other. And once that happens, the case is no longer one story. It becomes 3. At this stage of the investigation, something begins to change that no one can ignore anymore. It is not a new clue. It is not a new witness. It is something far more uncomfortable. It is the absence of closure. Because even after massive searches, after official declarations, after expanding investigations, the truth is still not forming into one clear direction. And when that happens in a missing child case, silence stops feeling like emptiness. It starts feeling like pressure. The investigation now circles back to the same unanswered space. What actually happened in that short window of time? Not hours, not days, a very small period, a gap where everything changed and nothing was seen again. And this is where the case becomes emotionally heavier than before, because everyone involved knows something important. In most disappearances, time always leaves traces. But here, time left nothing. The official search operation across Oak Park Station and surrounding areas had already been described as extensive. Ground teams, air support, specialist units, volunteers, and even tracking assistance from experienced personnel. Large sections of land were covered. Dams were checked. Mine shafts were examined. Surrounding areas were scanned repeatedly. But despite all of this, there is still no confirmed physical trace of Gus in any direction outside the initial point. And that fact slowly changes how investigators think. Because when a search becomes this wide and still returns empty, it forces a difficult realization. The answer may not be far away. It may be closer than expected, but that idea is never spoken loudly because it carries emotional weight that no one wants to fully accept. At the same time, investigators continue reviewing earlier statements and timelines, not because they are searching for blame, but because the structure of the timeline itself is under pressure. Small gaps were already identified, not dramatic contradictions, just inconsistencies, missing clarity in sequence. And in investigations like this, even small gaps matter, because gaps are where truth can either hide or break apart. Then comes another difficult development. A person connected to the property had initially assisted authorities, providing information, helping establish movements, cooperating during early stages. But later, that cooperation changed, and that change is not ignored. Because in investigative logic, behavior shifts are often as important as physical evidence. Not because they prove guilt, but because they change direction. And direction is everything in a missing case. Now the investigation is no longer standing in one simple structure. It is not lost child. It is not clear abduction. It is not confirmed accident. Instead, it exists in a space where every theory has weaknesses. And that is what makes it disturbing. Because when every explanation starts to collapse under its own missing pieces, there is no comfortable answer left, only uncertainty. Authorities had already considered multiple possibilities earlier in the investigation, including external involvement and internal involvement. But as time passes and no external trace appears, the balance between theories begins to shift, slowly, quietly, without announcement. And this shift creates a painful realization. If the land shows nothing, and there is no confirmed outside trace, then the center of the investigation cannot remain outside forever. It moves inward again, not as accusation, but as logic. This is the point where the case becomes emotionally heavier for everyone involved. Because every direction being reviewed leads back to the same starting environment, the same property, the same time window, the same unanswered moment. And that moment becomes the center of everything. Investigators continue to re-examine the structure of events around the disappearance, not to find a new story, but to see if the existing story actually holds under pressure. And when they apply that pressure, something becomes clear. The timeline is not complete, not in a way that allows full reconstruction. There are still spaces where certainty does not exist, and those spaces matter, because missing time is not neutral. It always hides something. At this stage, public communication remains careful and controlled. Authorities emphasize that the investigation is ongoing, that all possibilities remain open, that further searches may still take place. But between those official words, there is an unspoken truth. The case is no longer expanding outward. It is tightening inward, and that tightening creates the final emotional tension. Because the more the investigation narrows, the fewer answers remain available. And when only a few explanations are left, each one becomes heavier. Each one becomes harder to accept. Now, the central question emerges again, not as speculation, but as the core, unresolved point of the entire case. What happened in that small window of time when Gus was last seen? Because everything depends on that moment, and everything after it leads back into silence. Even the most detailed search operations cannot change one fact. No confirmed trace explains the transition from last seen to missing. That gap remains untouched, and that gap is where the entire case lives now. And this is where the final emotional weight begins to build. Because without physical answers, without confirmed evidence, without a clear path forward, only questions remain. Where's Gus now? Why does every explanation feel incomplete? Why does every direction end in uncertainty? And most importantly, why does the starting point still hold more questions than answers? Because when investigators step back and look at the full picture, they are left with something deeply unsettling. Not a solved case, not a closed narrative, but a space filled with missing certainty. And that is where this chapter leaves us, not with resolution, but with something heavier, a truth that is still not fully formed. And maybe that is the most disturbing part of all. Sometimes the truth does not disappear. It simply never becomes clear enough to be seen.